My name is Anita Godes, and I am a professor of international and cybersecurity at the Hertie School in Berlin. And this event is part of the Fundamental Rights in Practice event series, which is hosted by the Center for Fundamental Rights. This specific event is co-hosted with the Center for International Security. Both of the centers are housed at the Hertie School, so we're very excited to have you all here today. As you know, because you've joined this event, across the world, more and more public spaces are being placed under digital surveillance. Cameras capture us while we're going on about our everyday life, but importantly, they also capture us when we take to the streets for more political reasons, such as the case of protests or other types of public civic action. And so in the last year, we've seen that a whole host of studies and importantly, many activists have alerted policymakers and technology companies to the fact that the communities facing the most adverse consequences of modern facial recognition technology tend to be Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as other marginalized populations. And so this is the topic we will be discussing tonight. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our star-studded panel that will be discussing on the ways in which facial recognition is posing a fundamental challenge to human rights. The event will commence with a presentation by Marcus Biko and Dr. Matt Mahmoudi from Amnesty International, and will then be followed by a discussion with our own Professor Kathleen Costello. So let me first introduce our speakers from Amnesty International. We have with us today Marcus Biko, who is the Secretary General of Amnesty International in Germany, and he's also the chair of Amnesty's Steering Group on Human Rights in the Digital Age. Marcus Biko was appointed Secretary General of the German section in 2016, and he has been in active leadership positions within Amnesty Germany, but also with the International Secretariat in London since 2004. So he's been with Amnesty for a long time. He holds an MBA from the University of Cologne, where he studied business administration and economics. So a very warm welcome to you, Marcus Biko. We're very excited to have you here. Joining him for the second part of the presentation will be Dr. Matthew Mahmoudi, who is a researcher and advisor on artificial intelligence and human rights at Amnesty International. There he leads the efforts to ban facial recognition technologies. And he is one of the founders of the collective titled No Tech for Tyrants. You can check them out online. And it's part of a collective that tries to hold higher education and specifically the UK government to account or accountable for their entanglements with Silicon Valley. Matt recently completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge, where he researched on smart cities as new frontiers for migrant violence and digital border control. So we're very delighted to have you both. I will briefly introduce our own Professor Catherine Costello. She's a professor of fundamental rights at the Hertie School. She's also co-director of the Center for Fundamental Rights, and she's an absolute expert on European and international refugee and migration law. She's published widely on these topics: EU asylum and migration law, international refugee law, and specifically the relationship between migration and labor law. So Dr. Costello will come in to discuss the presentations once we're done. We will then open up for public discussion. I'm happy to call on you to ask your questions. Please use the chat function to just write in the chat your name, and I will call on you to then unmute your microphone and ask the question directly to the panel. So without much further ado, we're very excited and look forward to your contributions. I will first give the floor to Marcus Biko. Please take it away.
Yes, hello, good evening, and thank you for the opportunity for all of us to reach out to your screens tonight. I'm wondering, I'll now share my screen with you. So I do hope you can now see my screen.
Perfect.
Wonderful. So yes, as I said, thank you for the opportunity to speak with each other tonight and to be here. And as I said, share some thoughts, reaching out to your screens tonight. And I assume you're all sitting in front of some electronic device, your computer, joining now yet another video call. Video calls we've been getting used to, and video calls where when you're on air, you need to remind yourself to sit upright and to do certain things, but rather not do other things, and maintain a concentrated look while the camera is directed at you. And at the same time, I think we all are very much aware that video calls, there are those moments where you're grateful, where you can actually turn off your camera, like some of you have done. Now imagine having this situation wherever you go, a camera showing and watching you once you've left your private home and you're never alone. And it's a camera which you don't have access to the off switch. You can't turn it off. And this is not a hypothetical scenario like some might think. And we just heard already, and we are always reminded, surveillance is present. And it's not only, many of us are aware that surveillance is, for instance, present in Chinese cities. And just to give you some number, by this year, China is expected to have 560 million cameras installed, about one for every 3 citizens, of course, with a higher density in cities and with numbers rising. So 18 of the 20 most surveilled cities are in China, and 54% of all CCTV cameras are in China at this point of collection of data. And as you can see here, and you will have seen some reports and pictures that according to these reports, it's not only cameras, but these cameras are linked to China's social scoring system, while even some others now have been recently equipped with thermal scanners to actually work within the COVID-19 pandemic as an additional system. But it's also quite clear, and I think it's important that to remind us that you don't have to travel to China to feel watched. Among cities globally, actually London ranks among the top 5 with more than 620,000 cameras. That's 1 camera for every 16 citizens. And it is estimated that a London resident is caught on 300 cameras per day. But in case you're joining us from Germany, like I'm currently in Berlin, you might be surprised that actually 5.2 million cameras are actually installed in Germany, which is actually slightly more than estimated in the UK, even if 620,000 of these in the UK are in London. So cameras in public spaces, they are intrusions into our privacy. But I think tonight what we're looking at, especially with facial recognition, is like most digital devices currently, CCTV cameras are facing an update. And it's that update with facial recognition technology, FRT, which we'll be using, which you will be seeing now on the slides and when we're discussing. And more countries are rolling out facial recognition technology to public spaces. And according to a study by Algorithm Watch, police authorities of at least 10 EU countries make use of facial recognition technology, with another 8 countries planning to introduce the technology. So it's just around the corner. And of course, it's been using CCTV cameras in combination with new software and commercial databases to track individuals. And I'd like to make a distinction, because it's not only to track individuals, but it's to identify them. The software is built by companies using millions of images scraped from social media accounts and other sources without people's prior knowledge or even consent to this. And what do I mean by identification purposes? Facial recognition technology can be used for verification or identification. Verification answers the question, is this really the person they claim to be? And such technology is of course used at airports when they're actually comparing whether you're the person who's carrying this passport or borders, or even to unlock your phone. Bystanders are not affected by this. In contrast, if you use facial recognition to answer the question, who is this? It's an issue of identification. And it's the use of identification in public spaces which affects people. And are we aware of this happening? Have we given our consent? Would we agree if we were to be asked? So according to a survey of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, over 80% of the European population, people asked, rejects sharing images of their face with public authorities for identification purposes. And Amnesty shares their concern. We believe facial recognition is capable of completely ending the free and unobserved movement of people in public spaces, especially if it's combined with other information. So from a human rights perspective, this use is highly problematic, and that's the focus what we're looking at today. One question beforehand. Don't we need facial recognition for security and safety and to provide protection? So according to the authorities and lawmakers, it's often said that facial recognition technology is deployed to prevent or solve crimes, to find missing children or lost seniors. And I think they are all clearly understandable causes, and they are. But often the political debate focuses solely on the aim of this measure and of this intrusion and infringement of rights. But there should be a three-part test, as there is under international human rights law, which many of you will be familiar with. And that's not only whether the measure is useful for its laws, but it's very much about checking whether not only the aim of the measure is the criteria, but restrictions must be provided by law. They must be necessary and proportionate to put in place. And how do we, in addition to that, take into account that they are private actors providing data for facial recognition, like, for instance, an American company called Clearview AI. So let's look at the proportionality and legality of facial recognition technology in public spaces. And let's have a look at only three arguments before we look at some examples, and they are not the only ones. And these are the three arguments we have a look at before we move on to Amnesty International's research and campaigns, and also look at current legislation, especially on the EU side. So argument number one, facial recognition constitutes mass surveillance. Amnesty argues that facial recognition in public spaces is by design a technology of mass surveillance. The use of it in public spaces is not linked to a justified suspicion of misconduct. And this is not an oversight. Targeted use is not possible within this design, because people passing by chance are a constituent feature of public spaces, even if they are not searched for by the algorithm or by any other means, they are affected. So, and this is also what courts across Europe have found. They found mass surveillance to be disproportionate, especially when used by authorities with operational powers such as police forces and against also their own populations. And we've also seen the decision by the German Constitutional Court last year on mass surveillance and the German BND, which is the Foreign Intelligence Service. So Amnesty International believes that warrantless mass surveillance violates fundamental principles and can never constitute a proportional interference with the rights to privacy, to freedom of expression, assembly and association, and therefore always violates human rights. So it might not be obvious why facial recognition is an interference with freedom of expression and the right to protest. So let's go to argument two. States are increasingly turning to facial recognition technology to police protests, festivals, and even sports events. And this can create a chilling effect and seriously deter individuals from using their right to demonstrate, to assemble, or any other form of expression. And cities such as Moscow are currently vastly expanding security camera monitoring in public spaces, and lawsuits by protesters about this intrusive nature of facial recognition technology, I need a drink, were largely rejected by Russian courts. Russia currently has the third highest number of CCTV cameras in the world. And I think we are all very much aware of the current incidents and things going on Russian streets and what this means to freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And we see in Russia and also other parts that during the COVID-19 pandemic, these vast networks of facial recognition technology in Russia, but also in other MENA countries, has been used also on individuals in various ways. And if you look in a survey following 3 years of probationary use of facial recognition technology by the London Metropolitan Police, people responded that they would avoid places where facial recognition technology was used, and young people, 38%, and people of color in particular, responded that they would avoid an area if facial recognition technology were used there. Why, for instance, people of color? There is a reason for that, and that brings me to argument number 3. Facial recognition technology in public spaces is discriminatory regarding race and gender, and also in other ways. Law enforcement usage of FRT disproportionately impacts Black and other minority communities because they are at greater risk of being misidentified and so falsely arrested. And just to look at some numbers, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, compared the photos of the US House of Representatives with a list of 25,000 criminals using the publicly available Amazon FRT recognition, which is at a very low cost, and the software matched 28 politicians with criminals. Of these, 40% were people of color, although they represent only 20% of the members of Congress. Another issue is the recognition of gender. For instance, trans or non-binary persons are often misrecognized by facial recognition technology because the systems, of course, categorize individuals based on a binary or standardized process. And this leaves little room for gender non-conforming persons. Now, companies developing the technology claim that accuracies have much improved. And this is true. And in the future, there might be facial recognition technology with identical error rates for all human beings across different groups. But facial recognition technology was born in a discriminatory way. And because it comes with the fundamental risk of being used to distinguish between people on the basis of characteristics such as ethnicity, of gender, or other. So is only the missing accuracy or a discriminate bias in data the problem? No, it's not. Because even when accurate, facial recognition can be harmful, be it because law enforcement agencies with problematic records on racial discrimination are able to use it, but it's also, as I just said, because it's being used to distinguish between people on the basis of characteristics. So looking at Chinese researchers who just published government-funded research on the capability of facial recognition technology to categorize people based on ethnicity. So the Chinese manufacturer Hikvision has been advertising that its facial recognition enabled cameras are being able to distinguish between Uyghurs and Han Chinese. And I think most of you are aware that Uyghurs, that the Muslim minority of Uyghurs in especially the province of Xinjiang are being suppressed and their rights are being infringed. And part of that, that system doing that is a very sophisticated surveillance system. And there it even goes beyond the research to not only identify this group, but also to scan whether there are any emotional feelings. So not only saying this is an Uyghur, but this is an Uyghur who currently in this moment where we're filming him may have fear or may have anger, and then to add to that. So where facial recognition is used to selectively identify and prosecute a group, for instance, on the basis of ethnicity, optimizing the error rates does not improve the human rights situation for them. It can rather make it worse. Recently also, and before coming to some examples Amnesty has been campaigning on, facial recognition has come under scrutiny in the context also of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. And in a case involving an Amnesty Individuals at Risk case, Derek Ingram, a Black Lives Matter organizer, police officers were unable to produce a search warrant in an arrest which had been seemingly informed just by facial recognition technology. And this was the New York Police Department. Derek lives in New York, and my colleague Matt will now share with us and present an Amnesty tool for activists to decode surveillance in New York City. Thank you so far. See you soon.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for that fabulous introduction. If I could ask you to unshare your screen, and Matt can now share his screen.
Great. Let's see if we can. I'm here to talk a little bit about our campaign called Ban the Scan, which was launched on January 26th. It took a point of departure in New York City, but the campaign itself is much broader and is looking to cover a number of different strategic sites across the globe. As Marcus described, some of this work has now culminated in sort of a broader scale crowdsourcing action that is asking for citizens to get involved with mapping facial recognition. And I'll get into that in a moment. But to start with, I just wanted to get into some of the technicalities of facial recognition without repeating much of what Marcus was just talking about before. I think it's important to just rehash very quickly that facial recognition technology matters because it stands to fundamentally violate our freedoms to assemble, and as well as standing in the right of our right to protest, as was the case with Derek Ingram that Marcus also spoke about. Derek Ingram, of course, was a Black Lives Matter protester who was captured using facial recognition. But it also happens if you're not a protester, if you're just at your home. And sometimes, as we've seen in New York City, as was the case with the Atlantic Plaza Tower complex, ordinary residents will have landlords install facial recognition in an attempt to surveil especially poor, marginalized communities. So even if you're not protesting, this affects you, and this is something to keep in mind when you're wondering, well, I have nothing to hide and I'm not a protester, so how does this matter to me? So we've talked a little bit about how this involves large-scale scraping of images and how facial recognition is fundamentally based on the large-scale scraping of images. The Clearview software that Marcus described before, in particular, sort of works by, initially we're set up by just scraping loads and loads, millions and millions of images of people, creating a database around it, and then having basically footage from CCTV feed into that to see if there's a match. And I'll get into I'll get into how that matters for various different communities. So for minority communities in New York, as we've talked about before, it stands to fundamentally be a problem in this moment, especially at the second rising of the Black Lives Matter movement. We've also seen how it's been used against farmers protesters in New Delhi. It has also been used extensively against protesters in Hyderabad. We also know that it's being used, facial recognition, in the West Bank, and sort of sets a question mark around, what does it mean to be in the state of occupation when one is using facial recognition to perform said action. And then there's also a question around, to what extent companies that already have extensively potentially tarnished human rights records to engage in this space. And right, some of these companies were companies that Mark has also mentioned before. So Clearview AI, DataWorks, SenseTime, ClydeWalk, AnyVision, Huawei. This isn't a phenomena that has any polls really. While we see and hear in the media that a lot of the software is generated from the United States or from China, I think it's important to recognize that, in the Indian context, for example, the companies are homegrown, and there's lots that we still don't understand about the actors that are involved in facial recognition. But one thing is clear, and it is that things are moving in this direction, and there are lots of derivative products coming out of facial recognition that are also starting to become more pervasive. So you might have heard of emotion recognition, for example, as one of those. So as recently as just this summer, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, Professor Tendai Ochiume, came out and said that some technologies might be so vast in their ability to violate human rights that they will require outright bans, that simply having a momentary stop or a halt or a moratorium for that matter is not enough, because by design they require the abuse of certain rights. Facial recognition technology is one of set technologies, and that is why we as Amnesty have called as of this summer for a ban on the sales, production, deployment, and export of facial recognition technologies. So as a part of informing our campaign to operationalizing that ban, there's some questions that we've been asking ourselves, and our campaigning effort has been sort of a multi-pronged effort to both understand facial recognition as we've moved along, as well as to try and effect change in policy and legislation in the sites that we're interested in. So, some of the questions that we've been asking ourselves are, how pervasive are facial recognition technologies? How exactly have they been in breach of human rights? Who have they affected? What are the contexts in which they're most frequently used? Who are the companies, investors, government authorities behind them? How are they being resisted globally? And should we map it? So, some questions that informed originally our thinking around our theory of change. And I will say, the core behind our campaign, Ban the Scan, has been thinking about how, if we connect existing surveillance infrastructure of cities that we know are sort of bog standard CCTV cameras, and expose how exactly they plug into facial recognition, we could help with the assistance and partnership of local partners to hopefully effect towards a ban in those various sites. So in New York City, for example, we partnered with a number, I think a dozen of local organizations, predominantly racial justice organizations, as well as privacy rights organizations, to put pressure on the city council to introduce a ban on facial recognition, as well as to support the ongoing fight at the state level to introduce Senate State Bill S79, which is calling for a moratorium on the deployment of remote biometric surveillance technologies. So part of how we set out to do that in combination with our partnership with these local organizations was, we thought about, would it be possible to set up a sort of a living source of shame that would constantly kind of show how expansive facial recognition was and against whom it was being used the most. So thinking about, what could be a visual aid through which we could do this that could both intervene at the level of policymakers as well as at the level of media and the media landscape around it, and to also serve as a knowledge hub for activists and the general public who were looking to engage with facial recognition or to protect themselves. Whoa, excuse me. And so we really came down to a number of different options for what we could do. And one of the most popular sort of ideations that we had around this was, could we create a map? Before I get to that briefly, so we partnered with our local organizations. We worked with a few different artists as well in producing some of the content that we hoped would resonate most with our with the community that we had in mind. So in this case, New Yorkers. And some of that was, for example, the video that you saw at the start. We also developed a comic strip. I think most importantly, though, what this allowed us to do is to communicate with a heavily activated base of supporters who helped us gather some 7,000 Amnesty contributed, but 10,000 in total comments rejecting the facial recognition policy of the New York Police Department. And that is an overwhelming amount for a police department that didn't expect to get any or very few comments, at least in the consultation phase of their facial recognition policy. So that's been, tremendously from our side seen as somewhat of a success. Now, the second stage of our work has been centered around this mapping effort, and really to think about visualizing the chilling effect. I think, to Marcus's point before, one of the crucial negative implications of facial recognition is that it makes people less likely to engage in protest and in their assembly rights. And so that's what we refer to as a chilling effect, because they're afraid of being persecuted for exercising their perfectly legitimate rights. And so what we set out to do was, to see whether we could use Google Street View imagery to really help people, help us essentially tag cameras across their neighborhoods, and to see if we could use that data at the end of it to produce this map that could tell us what lenses can be used with facial recognition. So what we have, and I'm happy to show a demo, but again, it will depend on time. So I've just got a screenshot for the time being. What we have is essentially a website that you can go onto. It's on decoders.amnesty.org. You'll be dropped into a intersection. There are 40,000 intersections across all of New York City, and you'll be asked to identify cameras across different spaces in that intersection. Once you've tagged that camera, you're dropped into one other intersection. And just to give you a sense of how it's going, we launched this on Wednesday, and we've currently had 15,000 or so tasks completed across 700 volunteers, and that number is steadily rising. And the hope is that we'll be able to map that data across, say, demographic data that will tell us something like, neighborhoods around which there are particular practices of stop and frisk, or neighborhoods that are more poor, or, for example, walled in by cameras that could be abused with facial recognition. Again, happy to show a demo if we have time for it, but other than that, I think I'll stop there, such that I'm not taking up all of the time here, but yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt, for providing some insights on the ongoing campaign. That is very exciting. We now go to Professor Catherine Costello for some questions, remarks, and discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Anita, and thank you so much, Marcus and Matt. These human rights and practice events are really kind of central to the mission of the Center for Fundamental Rights, and creating a bridge between advocacy and academia. So I had a couple of comments and maybe just one or two questions.
Sorry, Catherine, there's something with your microphone that is giving some feedback.
Ah, okay. So is that better?
Yes, if you could cut, yeah, perfect.
So I had maybe 4 comments, and I'll conclude with a question then. I think I was really glad that you brought out the whole issue of mass surveillance and just articulating kind of the straightforward privacy violation that mass surveillance entails. And I think that's a kind of a crucial part of the discussion. I'm always really struck that one of the purposes that human rights are supposed to have is to sort of set up, sort of principles that we don't have to kind of argue about, and we can then just, argue about legality and proportionality and so on. But I think with privacy, because we've sort of been lulled into these sort of complacent notions about surveillance capitalism and an era in which we, surrendered a lot of data happily. I think reasserting the sort of rationale for the right to privacy and its sort of centrality is really important. especially because I've been a bit concerned that a lot of the public debate on these technologies is about the discrimination point, not to downplay that, but that, you know, the intrinsic harm of surveillance, I think, is really crucial to highlight. I recently reread Carissa Villetta's book, Privacy is Power. And I think one of the wonderful things she does in that book is remind us that we don't only have sort of an intrinsic sort of dignitary interest in privacy, but it's hugely instrumentally important for democracy and for society, because if we surrender too much of ourselves, we render ourselves really powerless in lots of contexts. And the account is really a sort of powerful reminder, I think. But then related to that, then I had a question about the protest arguments, because as you've explained it, and this Decoders project is really fascinating too, the claim there is slightly different because it's a chilling effect argument. So there may well be direct violations of a right to protest arising out of material that's caught on surveillance cameras. But I mean, that could be the case today using everyday CCTV. And I wonder about the chilling effect argument, and I guess it's a question for you both, you know, as an advocacy strategy or even as a legal strategy, whether that argument is it's easy to make legally. I mean, if it's not an easy argument to make legally, it may still be a very important political and ethical argument. But I was quite interested because I suppose a lot of the harms of these technologies seem to me to be also very indirect. I mean, very important, but not as direct a harm as the sort of privacy invasion of mass surveillance. Then I had just a point about legality and proportionality. And I think the UK example is so interesting because in a way, the UK has made itself a laboratory of these technologies. And in a way that's helpful if you want to make arguments against them, because as you know, the Court of Appeal in the UK argued that there was no legal basis for the use of facial recognition technologies, and because it didn't have a proper legal basis. But because it could decide that issue on this kind of narrow ground, it didn't have to actually get into the proportionality question. But I think that because there is a body of evidence about how CCTV has worked or not worked in the UK, it's actually a bit easier to argue the disproportionality case, especially from a crime prevention point of view, because CCTV doesn't really prevent crime. I think there's a bit of an evidence base that it seems to be quite good in car parks and in a few discrete locations in relation to crimes against property. Of course, it's not a panacea for crime prevention, obviously. But in the UK, you can demonstrate that empirically because people have been studying it, because CCTV on a massive scale was rolled out, you know, quite a long time ago now. So those were my kind of points about proportionality and legality, and privacy itself, which I think is really vital here. On the discrimination point, I think, and Marcus, you did make this point in your presentation, but I think it seems to me that it's a slightly double-edged argument sometimes when we're highlighting problems with training data. So some of the most catastrophic experiments with algorithmic processes, which have been shown to be highly discriminatory, just come about because of egregious gaps in training data. And then we say, whoops, we forgot to check what impact this would have on women or people of color. But in some ways, I think the tech industry sees this as an invitation to make these tools better. And then really, do we have a riposte for that if that's the way we frame the discrimination argument? And on that, I think some of the work also by, for example, by Sandra Wachter on discrimination in algorithmic decision-making is really important, because there are contexts in which the way these processes work, and obviously these processes means lots of different things, but often we look at past history as a sort of to learn how processes should be automated. And her point about lots of the contexts in which algorithmic decision-making is made is that looking at the past is just inherently a bad way of doing it, because it's just going to amplify previous discriminatory patterns. So I guess my final point then was, you know, I feel like we're just, I mean, some of you woke up to this very early, and in my case, I woke up to this very late. So I'm not a producer as yet of scholarship in this field. You know, I feel like the first generation of people who were confronted with social media and smartphones, you know, made catastrophic errors, and the sort of surveillance capitalism that we've allowed to flourish is just, you know, truly mind-boggling in its, you know, sort of potential for harm. So it's actually really heartening to read the survey results where young people are attuned to the risks involved in both surrendering data and in kind of surveillance technologies. But the crazy thing is, of course, a lot of these harms were done because the field is totally unregulated. And so, as we all know, yesterday, the European Commission finally proposed its system for AI regulation. Again, just the very fact that that just happened yesterday is astonishing. And of course, it's really only the EU is going to regulate this at the global level. It will become the global standard, as we know from GDPR. I know you've had not much time to digest it, but I'm curious for your sort of first take. And as I understand it, it's a little bit underwhelming, particularly on the question of facial recognition technologies. But I just wanted to open up that for discussion.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Marcus, Matt, any immediate reactions? Who would like to go first? I see your hand is up, Marcus, please go ahead.
I was just wondering whether Matt wants to go first, but okay, I'll take a stab. So yes, thank you, lots of stuff. And I think what we are seeing here is that looking at this very concrete challenge in an area where things are moving on and countries are rolling out facial recognition technology without clear accessible laws is just one example of so many areas. And as you said, we are operating in a space in which not only legislation is missing, but even public intense discussion on a broader perspective. And huge numbers of citizens are not even not only not aware, but not able also to actually participate in this discussion. So I think, so this is also part of the reason why, and Matt can talk to that, but if you look at some of our campaigning activities, it's not only about looking for regulation and looking for clear frameworks, but also trying always to have elements which actually bring this to the public space and to put it out for discussion. On privacy, rather than connected to, you were challenging the chilling effects on protest and assembly as just one part, and what's the other part, and so on. I think, unfortunately, what we see throughout the world is, and just looking at Russia, for instance, this week, what we see is that this is not only about chilling effects, be it Black Lives Matter activists actually targeted, be it people in Russia being targeted who take to the streets. This is very concrete in actually many places in the world. So not only a chilling effect, but people might not, I mean, what we gradually realize that while some are astonished what's going on and how did police authorities target me, there is a learning understanding of what's going on. And of course, it's not only facial recognition in public spaces, but of course it's linked to targeted surveillance of activists, of journalists. And it is the combination of different data which then is being used. So I am afraid that we will go beyond the discussion of chilling effects because we actually see things happening. On the UK, I mean, to be honest, I am not an expert on the UK, but coming from the Snowden revelations and all that, what we saw with the inquiry group set up, but then also the decisions by the courts, it has been very disappointing. This argument that just because things were not based on law, that was the problematic part, but laws were not actually tested to their application of fundamental principles of rule of law, of the Constitution, and others. We do hope that the EU approach, as you said, it always has the opportunity to set standards. I'm afraid, so it's good that the EU is now moving in these areas. I think it's especially good not only to look at the EU besides the US and China, but also looking at the opportunity for us to have a discussion which for large parts of the rest of the world, the global south, also to actually envision that there can be a modern digital world which respects human rights and which allows human rights to continue to be there. So I think it's very crucial that we are discussing this, and just looking at the proposal, I think, yes, it's hope. It's great that the draft lays out a concept of high-risk artificial intelligence applications. So, for instance, a ban on social scoring systems. I think that's good. But in other parts, from our perspective, so far we've seen it, the rules really fall short of what is needed, especially now coming to facial recognition technology. And we do believe that there has to be a ban for indiscriminate surveillance. And just finally, just not to be too long, going back to the point of discrimination and data which carries bias and so on, I hope that we can take the discussion in general to a broader level about some fundamental questions of self-determination. I mean, human rights are very much connected to the possibility of self-determination. And we are moving into connected systems which, on the basis of history and historical data, try to determine not only what is to be expected to happen, but also try to determine not only behavior of individuals, but actually set the scene in a way that an individual might no longer be able to self-determine. And this starts with information you are able to access. We already now see that depending on from where you're trying to access information with what device, you will not be able to receive the same information as others are. And that, of course, is already determining what your activity will be. And this is a very slight border to come to the point of manipulation, where actually, because you are only receiving certain information, or you're only able to maneuver in certain spaces, there is a high probability that you will take certain decisions and not even think about other decisions. Perhaps so far from my side at this point.
Many thanks, Marcus. Before I turn to Matt, just again, the point that if you want to ask a question, do drop your name in the chat. And I will then call on you once we open the discussion more broadly. But Matt, please.
Thank you. I think I'll go backwards from your point, Catherine. So on the AI regulation, since we're on the topic already, I think one of the key oversights, of course, beyond the welcome ban on social scoring, is for facial recognition in particular, where it only addresses real-time facial recognition, and for facial recognition that is most pervasively used. So for non-live facial recognition, software-based facial recognition that is used in combination with existing CCTV infrastructure, it falls woefully short. And that is what we need banned, right? Like, and not that it's not a good thing that we have real-time banned at all. I think, however, thinking back to what Marcus said about self-determination, software-based facial recognition is a technology that is literally based on, as we discussed before, the mass scraping of people's images from social media in order to produce a software that is capable of identifying your face. And so it is by design built to be a technology of mass surveillance. It is by design incompatible with human rights. And as a progressive or somewhat self-determining progressive institution, the European Union has a responsibility to ban any technology that stands to, especially, by design, be a technology that is incompatible with human rights. There's no amount of conformity assessments, third-party conformity assessments, that can make facial recognition for mass surveillance acceptable within the European Union or anywhere else in the world. So I will just say again, my main grievance with the AI regulation remains between the tenuous distinction between the real-time facial recognition and non-live facial recognition, which makes it appear as though non-live is significantly less risky, which it isn't. And then going back to your third point around the inaccuracy argument, I think there's something really chilling to riff off that, about how inaccuracy arguments, as discussed, lead to technologists saying, well, yeah, so we'll just design better systems that are more capable of picking up the right hue, if you will, of skin tone. And the fact of the matter is that what we're permitting there is sort of an expansion of surveillance systems even further. So the inaccuracy argument can't be at the center of this. I think there's something particularly interesting looking back at sort of colonial history in general around, you know, a sort of imagination of knowing the unknowable subject, which I think is core of what is driving the technical effort towards being better at picking up different skin tones, being better at picking up different forms of distinctions, being better at picking up the deviant subject, the person who is seen as a potential criminal or as a potential threat. And the moment that we say that we should make these systems better, these systems of surveillance, these systems that fundamentally are intertwined with the criminal justice system to pick up faces and bodies that are deviant, that is a moment in which we almost double down and reinforce that sort of neo-colonial notion that certain people are more deviant and more suspicious than others. And so there I would caution, again, once again, a huge warning against centering the inaccuracy argument, although it is of course important. It is of course especially important when it comes to being able to accessing services contingent on, say, your face being identifiable. But there I would say, again, should we really have a technology mediate our access to, say, socioeconomic rights or health rights when those are fundamental, right? So there I would say in those cases, there should be a way of accessing those rights without having it mediated in such a way. On the CCTV doesn't improve crime argument, again, that's sort of the first starter, I think, even when it comes to facial recognition. You know, there's an argument there to be made about, well, if we've seen based on the data that nothing is improving, then why are we further sophisticating these systems? It's sort of like a Stockholm syndrome, which I think is key to how the tech industry is carried out today. Is very much, as you say, Catherine, as well, sort of like, I mean, I personally have qualms with surveillance capitalism as a framing, but I do think it's interesting how, you know, rather than saying maybe the system of keeping security in place doesn't work, we're more inclined to think, well, we should just make that system more aggressive. And I think this requires a whole reimagination of what public safety means. And that's a far more ambitious endeavor, but I think one that we need to engage in if we are to also think about reimagining what technologies are needed for a just and fair society. So taking it back to your first question around the mass surveillance versus chilling effect, again, just to echo Marcus as well, I think it's important to say that for facial recognition in particular, we have seen the harmful outcomes of both false arrests as well as arrests that were made on the correct individual based on the image, but that were made with no warrant, that was made also including pictures of people who were not subject to the particular event that the person that was actually the subject of the image was being accused of. And also at the same time, I mean, I'm of the conviction that you can hold both the idea that these systems are causing real, you know, measurable harms on individuals right now and communities right now, and we can see those things by way of violations of human rights. But we can also hold that it is making society less likely to engage in rights that are increasingly being criminalized or seen as not having a place in this particular moment of, say, emergency, right? We've seen in the UK how the protest bill was rolled out, and there's a concern there around also how that intersects with the introduction of further facial or further forms of facial recognition adjacent types of technology, emotion recognition, thermal recognition, which has been used at the end of the first lockdown in private establishments to measure people's temperature. So again, I think there is something to be said about the chilling effect still mattering in terms of who will feel more at liberty to expose themselves, not just protests, but even to just accessing everyday goods and services on the premise of how much at risk they are by exposing themselves. And that varies, of course, across identities. That varies for someone who has precarious immigration status. That varies for someone who might be a person of color, or someone who is trying to, for whatever reason, escape or or flee, say, cases of domestic abuse, there are sensitivities around privacy that should be respected in a free society. But I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you so much, Matt. Catherine, let me give it back to you. Any reactions from your side? Additional questions?
No, I think I'd like to bring in others at this point. I mean, I think we agree a lot, and that some of the big questions are questions of strategy and how we get here. But I mean, I think thinking about advocacy for organizations like Amnesty, and then the role of scholars in informing regulatory debates, I think that's would be really interesting to discuss a little more. But I'm curious to see what our audience want to raise with us.
So I'm currently waiting for anyone to join our discussion. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please do just use the chat to indicate that you have a question. While we are still waiting for participants to join us, Catherine, feel free to expand on those questions if you'd like.
Yeah, I suppose what has really surprised me, I mean, my experience and my knowledge of these technologies comes from a couple of different sources, but one is sort of as somebody who works on refugee issues and migration, obviously an awareness of, you know, travel being a context which is highly surveilled. And we've sort of gotten used to that idea that airports are places where you'll have multiple images taken. But I'm always struck that we've created this very strange world in which certain types of people can access legal means of travel that are highly regulated. But of course, we have containment practices that mean typically refugees coming to Europe don't have access to those routes and put themselves, and probably us too, at massive risks in some ways. And so it's this kind of strange regulatory choices, you know. And if you have a debate about, you know, it's become a cliche now saying, well, wouldn't it be safer for everyone if refugees could also get on planes or apply for asylum at embassies? It's somehow framed as this very unrealistic position. And then we invest more in technologies in this one area and leave, you know. So I think just that the necessity to sort of zoom out and look at, you know, how we're investing so much in certain notions of security while we're also doing these very counterproductive things in other fields. And I think the other thing that really strikes me is the role of the corporate power here. And there are numerous examples of corporations offering these technologies really on the cheap to humanitarian organizations. And so if you're a refugee in Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan, you use your iris scan to go shopping. And this was, you know, this is the humanitarian sector. This is UN agencies who are not formally, at least, bound by GDPR even, and whose subjects are really at risk from numerous different potentially persecutory states if they got access to their data. And I mean, just how, yeah, I mean, the naivety of thinking that, you know, these technologies were always going to serve the purposes they were being sold for is really, it really strikes me. And so those were some of the examples that I think have really brought me to thinking more, you know, in a more intensive way about, yeah, you know, why would you want to use these types of technologies? Well, partly it's that somebody's trying to sell them to governments or to international organizations and other actors. And I think the fact that this is a sort of circular economy, so like that, well, why are these companies doing this? Well, for the data. So that, I mean, and I guess that's why, I mean, I'd be interested to know, Matt, about the phrase surveillance capitalism, but I think it captures the fact that, you know, we are also the product ourselves, because then, you know, new products are designed using data, which are then sold to other actors. And it seems to, yeah, there's something really deeply dystopian about that cycle as far as I can see.
Fantastic. I see Matt has his hand up to react, and then I'm happy to say that we have a number of questions from the audience. Go ahead, Matt.
Thank you. I'll keep this super short, Catherine, but to your point, I think, especially as a critical race and digital studies scholar who focuses on migration stuff in my academic hat, this is a really important question. And I think the reason why, say, I take issue with, say, surveillance capitalism as a framing is because Shoshana Zuboff frames this particular moment as capitalism having gone rogue. And I think there's something far more fundamental to the way that capitalism operates, which tells us about why these technologies are designed the way that they are, and that it isn't something that came about with Facebook, and that it is something that goes back way further. And for example, to your point about how refugees and migrants and fugitive subjects are treated as sort of labs, right, on whom these technologies are experimented on the backs of whom data is generated. And sometimes I'd argue it isn't even data extraction, but it's data creation. The idea that the idea of the abstract notion of a refugee alone can feed a KPI, which in turn can justify funding. And that's often what we see in this space, this sort of fake or surrogate data, which I call it in my work. And I think that circular economy is something that you can trace back to the founding of what Cedric Robinson refers to as racial capitalism as opposed to capitalism, right? Like it's the idea that we have always seen the intersection of class and race play a role in how society produces and manufactures, and how technologies of control have always been fundamental to that. What we're seeing in this moment is just a digitalization of that, and sort of a digitalization of similar practices of containment and categorization that fed, for example, British colonial endeavor in India, right? The Indian census is an example of that, of categorizing individuals for the purposes of increasing productivity and extraction. And we're seeing the same thing play out in refugee camps, just using tech and with tech companies being involved in this sort of techno-governmental logic of governing the camp. So I think that's incredibly important to keep in mind, is that this isn't new. What's new is the scale at which it can be done. As you say, the barriers to entry have lowered. Tech companies can do this, and they gain symbolic capital by virtue of being endorsed by humanitarian organizations and governments who give them legitimacy. And they can do this because refugees don't have the same consumer protection rights as you and I. And so that to me is like this dystopian part. And as soon as we say, actually, and this is where I think dilemma comes in, the paradox is that as soon as we say tech companies are too powerful, they also gain the legitimacy, right? Every time we compare the tech company to the state, we're bestowing upon it state-like status. So I think we have to be better at saying, these are the limits, these are the red lines. The AI regulation, for example, for the EU was a key moment, could have been a key watershed moment in which we did that, but we didn't. I'm gonna stop there.
Thank you. We're going to take two questions now from the audience. First, we have Neela, and then we have Agnes. Neela, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear and see
Yes.
me. So first of all, thank you very much for your very insightful inputs. I would also like to come back to the Artificial Intelligence Act, which was proposed yesterday by the EU Commission. And I see a very strong focus on biometric identification in this regulation. And they also suggest a ban on, if I'm correct, real-time remote biometric identification with some like narrow exceptions for like the search of missing children, or for prevention of terrorist attacks, etc. And I was wondering what your uptake on that is. What are your thoughts on that ban? You agree with those exceptions, or in your opinion, should there be exceptions or shouldn't there be exceptions, and to what scale, especially when looking at national security agencies and law enforcement? Thank you.
Thank you, Neela. And next we have Agnes.
I hope you can all hear and see me. Great. I really quickly just wanted to frame why I'm coming at you with this question, which is more of a devil's advocate, right? I am currently doing my PhD in intelligence and national security. And one of my supervisors is Joe Kanatachi, who many of you will know is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to privacy. So this idea of privacy whilst countering terrorism is one of the areas in which I'm currently researching. And I particularly get AI-enabled technologies that are not facial recognition. So, but my research started here, right? Facial recognition. And I'm really happy, you know, that Matthew also mentioned emotion detection, because I think it's the biggest farce out there that's being currently sold. My personal opinion, not what's in my PhD just yet, but and indeed, as Catherine said, the sort of push out towards the humanitarian community, be like, oh, here, go use that, is absolutely terrifying. But in my conversations with intelligence and policing practitioners, one of the things that they've continuously brought forward is said, look, take this example of the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, right? We were looking for perpetrators, and had we had access to facial recognition, we could have kept more people safer quicker, right? And so they're framing this really as a human rights, right to life, right to safety debate that they're protecting rather than rights that they're infringing upon in terms of the mass surveillance. So I'd be really interested in hearing what you would say to those people. And alternatively, is there another way? Because I did hear some of you say, you know, maybe remote heartbeat technology, thermal technology. Is there another way in which you would say, okay, well, this is maybe slightly less bad? Should we just bin it all? I'm really interested in sort of opening up that discussion on some of the more emerging technologies if there's space for that. Thank you.
Great. Any takers? Marcus, Matt, feel free to unmute yourself and join the discussion.
I feel like I've taken up a lot of space. Marcus, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I'll try to give it a go. So perhaps on the power of big tech, I understand. Yeah, so Matt was going at the problem of even if we speak of power, and I think if we speak of power, I think we need to always make sure that we go back to rule of law and the question of that big tech currently, it's not the problem. Yes, the problem is also the power and some economic issues on structure and space and scope and size and all of that. But I think what we need to focus on mainly is that we have a sector which is crucial to fundamental things, and it's beyond transparency and accountability and the rule of law. And as we have taken so much effort over the last 70 years in an international framework, in national frameworks, to strengthen and establish rule of law, I think that's the big picture which is not being discussed. So while we are discussing, should there be a regulation of facial recognition technology? Should there be a regulation on artificial intelligence and on what? So we are taking it bit by bit and pieces, but we're not looking at the big picture. And we are, of course, at some point, we are discussing that there's a huge space which is unregulated, but we have been taking on the framing of those who have been challenging regulation in any way. So I think the issue of so what we're gradually seeing, and that's good, is the responsibility of states to actually protect citizens, and for citizens to be able, by being sovereign, to actually participate in the rule of law. So I think that's one area. So moving away from the rule of arbitrary power or even systemic power to the rule of law. I think a huge challenge is this illusion of control and this perfect utopia, which is a dystopia. I think we are all struggling with that. It seems to be promising to people who are looking for security, for stability, and so on. I think we are not doing enough to actually show where some of this brave new world, best new world things are going. And I think the pandemic is again challenging us on this very much. I think, I'm concerned that we haven't been able to do more on this dynamic, which has been coming out of the pandemic. So I don't know, Matt, do you want to go for the security?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay, so the two questions. So how do we feel about the ban on remote biometrics? To the first question, I think that I think crucially what the regulation gets away with is appearing to be very progressive on facial recognition, but what it is actually progressive on, as discussed before, is real time. And so it leaves out this massively pervasive form of facial recognition, which is facial recognition for mass surveillance that is non-live, which is not being banned, which should be banned, right? So it's not enough for us to just do real time. And I think the regulation should do more. It should probably do away with facial recognition that is used the most. So that's on that point. On the second point around the Boston Marathon bombing, I think that's a really, really interesting and important question, because of course that's also the question that came up in the wake of the Capitol riots, and the sort of justification that we could use facial recognition to find them. And I think there are a couple of different points to make there. First of all, I think we're seeing what you guys will probably know as technosolutionism on steroids, right? Like the idea that computers can solve complex social, political, economic issues. So that's the first thing. The second part of this is that it often becomes a slippery slope, the sort of one exemption argument for wider application of massively invasive surveillance technologies in wider society. So for the case of, say, the Capitol riots, HN was open, police officers were on it. They were aware of who were protesting and who were going to show up at the riots for months and months before. There were conversations being had in the open about how one could smuggle firearms to DC. All of this was information that was known. And yet, when authorities failed to act in time on the Capitol riots, it was almost as if technology as sort of an excuse or a willful undercutting of the lack of political will became the go-to. Right? So then suddenly, in the absence of policing cracking down on these far-right white supremacists, drew to the argument that, don't worry, we've got this under control. We're going to use facial recognition and find them. When in fact, most of the identities of these individuals were known already. As for the Boston Marathon bombing, again, I don't think that there's a version that is more anonymous, to your point about whether thermal or heart rate monitoring, remote heart signature monitoring is more appropriate. I think, again, we're talking about a case of whether a technology for mass surveillance should be rolled out, like such as one-to-many facial recognition, versus a case of which, say, known subjects in a limited database should be searchable across a space. And I think, once again, with something that isn't regulated, or with something that has largely been demonstrated to have ill effects, and with something that we know erodes the rights of the many, and currently doesn't have any regulatory framework, you can't simply then excuse it. So I think if say there was a case to be made for the usage of facial recognition to find a Boston Marathon bomber, it would have to be a case in which, say, everything would have been exhausted and you're using one-to-one facial recognition, which is different. But again, we're not here to make the case for the usage. We're here to establish why it cannot be rolled out on mass society, and why specifically one-to-many facial recognition, which is the most used facial recognition for surveillance anyway, should not be rolled out under any circumstances. And I think, again, those specific cases kind of create the ability to have a slippery slope towards a surveillance state that is far more active than it would have been otherwise.
Great. So Mark Dempsey, you had your hand up and it's down again. Do you still have a question you'd like to ask?
Sorry, you caught me slightly unawares. I think I put it in the chat. So you've been talking about the fact that the AI regulation is not proposed for an all-out ban. I suppose I'm just curious as to why didn't they? That might sound like an obvious question. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. Thank you.
So maybe we have another question in the chat that I'll just read because I think it fits quite well. Let me just find it. There's a lot going on now, which is great. And there's a question from Ingrid, a question for Marcus and Matthew. Given the genie is out of the bottle, re the use of live facial recognition, what do you think the impact of the EU AI regulation will be on the use of LFR? And how do you think that this will affect the AI industry in the EU context? So maybe those two fit together a little bit.
Marcus, are you? No? Okay. Yeah, so I mean, okay, so I think those are related points, so I'll just treat them as one question. I think notably in terms of the AI landscape in Europe, I think this is precisely why this worries me. This regulation is supposed to set the scene for what is acceptable in terms of AI and AI enterprise within the EU, and then also where other countries take inspiration on regulation, and EU is a huge market. So again, it would have had significant power in prohibiting some of the more human rights eroding applications of AI. What I fear will happen is that things like facial recognition for identification and mass surveillance that isn't live is still going to be developed, that is going to undergo this third-party conformity assessment, that we're going to see other adjacent technologies that similarly don't work in live ways, but are still remote biometric surveillance technologies, but again, that aren't live. And we're going to see a situation in which these are at liberty to being developed, deployed, exported, sold, researched further. And I think that's a problem for a technology that, once again, we've established is designed to be almost, again, by design, incompatible with human rights principles. And then there's the question around, what will it mean for live facial recognition? Well, hopefully it would mean that live facial recognition would stop being developed, or at least, I guess, there is a version of this in which some companies may decide to relocate elsewhere. We saw with PimEyes, which was a easily accessible facial recognition website, when fuss was being made about their GDPR compliance, I believe they shortly after that moved to the Seychelles. So of course, that's also a problem. I wonder if we're going to start seeing the Seychelles fill up with various dodgy facial recognition technology companies, but that's sort of speculation at this stage. Yeah, Marcus, I don't know if you have any additional points to that.
There was a question on India, on Hyderabad, what you had mentioned, Matt. I don't know whether you saw it.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm happy to read that question. If there's no,
that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So if there's no response from you, if there's anything you want to add, Marcus, please do go ahead. Otherwise, there are two questions on India, actually. One is just some more information on what the current Indian government is doing in terms of facial recognition against Kashmiris, farmers, protests in Hyderabad. Just some more information on that. And then the question Oscar also says, as someone who works in autonomous vehicles, the amount of video data that's being generated worries me, and the way that that might be used under, what we've been discussing under the term of surveillance capitalism. So those two questions are from Waji, I think, yes.
Yeah, Marcus, did you want to start on this, or are you okay with me going?
Yeah, just perhaps on the data and automotive industry. I think a challenge beyond regulation and beyond human rights standards is that when we go back to the concept of surveillance capitalism and human beings being at the center and their data being at the center of this, that I think what would be hoped for in an ideal world that European industries, together with civil, we'd have to see how we actually get there. But I think currently every industry is looking at surveillance capitalism as the role model to economize and to gain profits from human behavior and human data. So as everyone is just following and trying to catch up with the valley, the question is, can Europe not only develop best practice on regulation, but can Europe or can European companies also, together with other parts of the world, come up with an alternative economic model, probably linked to open data, which we want to use within societies for public goods and so on, but also having a different strand on data and business. And I think this will be needed, because as we are only talking, we need a different positive vision on the digital economy, and that's a challenge which I think human rights organizations and politicians alone cannot tackle. So I think that's so important, why it needs to be raised to a level where we have a different discussion around that.
Yeah, so to the first, and also just to echo Marcus, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the reasons to why we are in the predicament that we are now is because of sort of the death of political imagination, if you will, or our imagination around what tech should do for society. And I think because we've gotten onto this deterministic path of what the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons of the world look like, we've kind of lost the creativity to think affirmatively about something that works better for society. But just to go back to the question around the Indian regime's use of facial recognition against Kashmiri farmers and protesters in Hyderabad. So what we know is that facial recognition, according to partners at the Internet Freedom Foundation, was used at the January 26th protests, the smaller scale protest of the farmers protests, as well as being used at the bill that was proposed earlier in 2019, the CFR, I believe, which was also subjected to facial recognition usage, that was developed by the Telangana Technology Institute, I believe they're called. What's more worrying is that because we know that facial recognition is being used following right to freedom information requests that were submitted to Hyderabad Police and Telangana State, we have worries that given that Telangana State also has the largest number of CCTV cameras across all of India, that this would stand to cause significant violations of rights, and particularly in particularly egregious ways. As of January 2019, in fact, it was reported by the Economic Times that Telangana state alone has 64% of the entirety of India's CCTV cameras. That's 274,000 or some such CCTV cameras, and we believe the majority of those are concentrated within Hyderabad. So again, huge reasons to be concerned, especially at a time when legislation to regulate or ban facial recognition has not so far been successful, in spite of early attempts at introducing it back in August 2020, apologies.
So I think we have a great final question here by Shrutika, which I will paraphrase, which is basically asking how we can regulate and hold accountable countries such as China for the mass abuse being carried out in accordance or in combination with mass surveillance. What can we do on that front? I think that might be a good final question to ponder for us.
I think to actually start with, of course, it's the transfer of technology, export of technology. If we look at the EU dual use regulation so far, while there has been surveillance technology in it, we believe it's not sufficient enough. That's just one part of the story, of course, but I think it's an important point. I think it will be an uphill battle to establish global minimum human rights standard and regulation. But I think we just have to take it forward, like have the EU discussion and then move step by step. I guess there is a point for a large number of countries not wanting to either be subject to a new colonialism, either linked to China or the Silicon Valley. I think there is a point for that. And people and states understand. I mean, I just recall that speaking in New York at a side session on the Security Council, and just listening to many politicians from across the globe who are struggling with this technology, which for a normal, smaller or medium-sized government is just, I mean, how would they tackle this? How are they able to actually maintain sovereignty and also maintain this for their citizens? Nearly impossible. And even if they buy systems, they don't actually know what's going on. They are not in total control. So I think this is an issue on the global level. And I think therefore there is some room and some space for a number of countries and governments to go back to international frameworks, to international order, and look for solutions there. It's not going to be easy. I think we will see a larger development which goes in the wrong direction first before we can perhaps regain and reclaim spaces. but I think as much, it's even more important that we keep trying.
Fantastic. With that, we are out of time. I would like to very, very much thank our fantastic panelists, Matt, Marcus, Catherine. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Thank you so much for sharing the fantastic work you're doing with Amnesty. This was very instructive for all of us, came very timely, of course, with this week's events. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for your great questions. And we look forward to having these discussions with you in the next few months as well. So everyone have a good night and hope to see you at our next event.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anita.
Thank you all so much for hosting.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.